What would you do if you had to choose between your own son and the fate of an entire nation? On a freezing morning in 1943, a telegram reached Joseph Stalin, dictator of the Soviet Union. His hands trembled as he read the words that changed everything: an offer of exchange. Across the table, his generals waited in absolute silence, knowing that a single word could cost them their lives. The man who decided the fate of millions now faced the most brutal decision of his life. He looked out of a Kremlin window, took a deep breath, and gave his answer. This was the impossible choice faced by one of history's most ruthless dictators, a moment that would reveal whether any humanity remained behind the Soviet leader's iron mask. Today, you will discover the story that forever changed the relationship between Stalin and his son amid the most devastating war in human history. Before we begin, we are working toward a goal of 1 million subscribers. It may sound like a lot, but with your help, we can get there. Subscribe now, leave a like, and become part of this story. Who was Yakov Dzugashvili? Yakov Dzugashvili was born on March 31, 1907 in the region of Georgia, then part of the vast and turbulent Russian Empire. He was the son of Kato Svanidze, a young woman of Georgian origin, and Joseph Stalin, a little-known revolutionary activist at the time who would go on to become one of the most powerful and feared figures of the 20th century, the future leader of the Soviet Union. At the time of Yakov's birth, Stalin was merely a rising Bolshevik activist, involved in clandestine activities against the Tsarist regime and constantly pursued by the authorities. Despite the difficulties, he nicknamed the boy Patsana, an insufficient Georgian expression, revealing, at least initially, an emotional bond with his son. Yet this brief display of affection would stand in stark contrast to the years of neglect, coldness, and tension that came to define their relationship. In the first months of Yakov's life, the family's routine was abruptly shaped by the revolutionary circumstances in which Stalin was immersed. Amid the struggle against Tsarist oppression and the search for funds to support the Bolshevik movement, Stalin took part in the Tiflis bank robbery in 1907, a landmark episode in the history of the Russian revolutionary movement. To escape the repression that followed, he went into exile with Kato and the baby in Baku, a city in present-day Azerbaijan. At the time, Baku was a strategically important oil center, relatively far from the watchful eye of the Russian authorities. There, they lived in precarious conditions, facing financial hardship and the constant fear of persecution. Their stay, however, was brief. Pressured by circumstances, they returned to Georgia later that same year. A few months later, on the 5th of December 1907, Yakov's life suffered a devastating blow. His mother, Kato, fell gravely ill and died of typhoid fever, leaving him motherless before he had even reached his first birthday. Her early death not only deprived Yakov of a maternal figure, but further destabilized his already uncertain family life. Devastated by his wife's death, Stalin reacted coldly and with extreme evasiveness. He not only avoided caring for his son directly, but also immersed himself even more deeply in his revolutionary activities. That moment marked the beginning of a long period of emotional estrangement between father and son. With Stalin's tacit abandonment, Yakov was placed in the care of his mother's family, the Svanidzes. They welcomed him warmly and raised him according to Georgian customs and traditions. Yakov grew up in that environment, surrounded by uncles and cousins who gave him a measure of emotional stability, even as he remained distant from the Soviet reality that was already beginning to take shape in Moscow. Because he was raised almost entirely in Georgian, Yakov had little contact with the Russian language during his early years. That would later make it difficult for him to adapt to the centers of Soviet power, where fluency in Russian was, of course, essential. Throughout his childhood and youth, Stalin's name was more a distant shadow than a real presence in his life. Only in adolescence, after Stalin had established himself as an important figure within the Communist Party and was living in the capital, was Yakov summoned to Moscow. The reunion between father and son was far from warm or reassuring. Instead, it revealed the emotional gulf between them. Stalin, hardened by political life and the party's internal struggles, received his son coldly. He showed no affection and saw Yakov as a fragile young man, perhaps a disappointment when measured against the austere image Stalin had created of himself. In a symbolic and cruel gesture, he forbade Yakov from using the surname Stalin, declaring that he was not yet worthy to bear it. Although Yakov lived in his father's spacious official apartment, he slept in an improvised corner of the dining room, a stranger in his own home. Even in this oppressive environment, Yakov tried to find his place in the world. Friends and colleagues described him as introspective, kind, and polite, with a calm temperament and a clear desire to be accepted, above all, by his father. Determined to forge his own path, he enrolled at the Institute of Transportation and graduated with a degree in electrical engineering. He then worked at a power plant, carrying out his duties conscientiously, perhaps as a way of proving his worth on his own merits. But in 1937, driven by both personal considerations and a desire to distinguish himself in another field, he entered the Red Army Artillery Academy, marking the beginning of his military career. Yakov's personal life, however, was no less turbulent than his relationship with his father. In 1928, he fell in love with Zoya Gunina, the daughter of an Orthodox priest, a choice that provoked a fierce reaction from Stalin. The relationship challenged both the Soviet leader's ideological hostility toward any trace of religion and his expectation of complete obedience and control over his son's life. Prevented from marrying her, Yakov fell into a deep emotional crisis that culminated in a suicide attempt. In desperation, he shot himself in the chest but narrowly survived. The bullet missed his heart by mere centimeters. Far from bringing father and son closer, the attempt only widened the gulf between them, making their relationship even more strained and painful. Even so, Yakov continued trying to build an independent life. After several unstable relationships, he married Yulia Meltzer, a Jewish ballerina. Once again, his choice deeply displeased Stalin, both because of his personal prejudices and his political concerns. In an increasingly paranoid and anti-Semitic regime, having a Jewish daughter-in-law made the Soviet leader uncomfortable. Yakov nevertheless stood his ground. Though he lived in the shadow of a domineering and emotionally absent father, he spent his life trying to assert his individuality and gain some measure of recognition, even if it never came from the person whose approval he wanted most. While all this was unfolding in the life of the young Yakov, the world was moving toward one of its bleakest and most brutal periods: the outbreak of war. When the Second World War began in September 1939 with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, the world watched in stunned disbelief as two ideologically opposed regimes, the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, formed an unexpected alliance. Just weeks before the offensive, on August 23rd of that year, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin shocked the international community by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty guaranteeing that neither power would attack the other. Behind this diplomatic facade, however, lay a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, allowing both the Nazis and the Soviets to expand their domains without interference from one another. For many, the signing of the pact was a profound shock. Nazi Germany, openly anti-Semitic, ultra-nationalist, and anti-communist, was entering a truce with the world's largest socialist state, a blatant ideological contradiction. For Hitler, however, the agreement was a tactical maneuver, a way to avoid a war on two fronts while consolidating his power in Western Europe. For Stalin, the alliance offered precious time to reorganize the Red Army, which was still recovering from the violent purges he himself had carried out in the preceding years, as well as an opportunity to reclaim territories lost since the First World War. In the first months of the war, cooperation between the two regimes proved surprisingly effective. On the 17th of September 1939, just days after the German attack, Soviet troops invaded eastern Poland, occupying the part of the country assigned to them under the secret agreement. The Soviet Union then extended its influence over the Baltic states, annexing Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, while also waging war against Finland in the winter of 1939 to 1940. Meanwhile, Hitler advanced through the west, defeating France, occupying Norway, and preparing to besiege the United Kingdom. On the surface, the non-aggression pact appeared to be working, but beneath the political surface, an inevitable tension was growing. Hitler never abandoned his obsession with the East. From the earliest chapters of Mein Kampf, the Nazi leader made it clear that he saw communism as an existential and racial threat. To him, Bolshevism was an expression of what he called an international Jewish conspiracy, and the Soviet Union represented not only a geopolitical obstacle, but also a racial and ideological enemy that had to be destroyed. The truce with Stalin, therefore, was nothing more than a temporary instrument. Hitler considered a confrontation with the Soviet Union inevitable and saw the pact as a springboard toward his larger objectives, the conquest of Lebensraum, or living space, in Eastern Europe, and the total eradication of Marxism. Central to Nazi ideology, the concept of Lebensraum called for German territory to expand eastward, particularly toward Ukraine and the Caucasus. Besides being fertile and rich in resources such as coal, wheat, and oil, the region was inhabited by peoples whom the Nazi regime's racial ideology deemed inferior, and therefore fit for enslavement or extermination. In that sense, the destruction of the Soviet Union was not merely a military ambition. It was an ideological and racial crusade. Hitler believed that victory over the Soviets would consolidate the supremacy of the Germanic people and eliminate communist influence from Europe once and for all. Although the pact with Stalin secured a temporary truce, a growing certainty took hold within the Nazi high command that the alliance was unsustainable in the long term. As rapid victories in the West strengthened Hitler's confidence, the idea of attacking the Soviet Union became increasingly inevitable in his plans. Even before any formal break, resentment toward the Bolshevik colossus was already simmering in the Führer's rhetoric and intentions. He regarded the Soviet presence as an affront to his vision of a racially and civilizationally ordered Europe. With every recent invasion having succeeded, Hitler decided to press ahead with his plans. At dawn, on June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, finally breaking its non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and unleashing the largest land invasion in human history. The offensive mobilized around 3 million Axis troops, supported by more than 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. They attacked along a front stretching thousands of kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Hitler believed that a lightning offensive could destroy the Red Army within weeks, seize the Soviet Union's industrial and agricultural centers, and subjugate the country before it had time to respond. The plan called not only for territorial conquest, but also for the mass extermination of Soviet civilians, particularly Jews, communists, and members of the intelligentsia. Unlike the earlier campaigns in the West, the war in the East was conceived from the outset as a war of annihilation. In the first weeks, Wehrmacht forces advanced with empowering speed. German troops quickly seized Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, pushed deep into Belarus and Ukraine, and encircled large contingents of the Red Army, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Soviet infrastructure was unprepared, the chain of command was confused, and many officers hesitated to make decisions without direct orders from Moscow, a reflection of the fear instilled by Stalin's purges in the preceding years. The psychological impact was profound. Stalin, caught completely off guard despite numerous warnings from foreign intelligence services that an attack was imminent, entered a brief period of shock and silence. For days, he isolated himself at his dacha outside Moscow without issuing clear orders, leaving the military leadership in a dangerous vacuum at a critical moment. When he finally regained control of the situation, his rhetoric became more aggressive. He called on the Soviet people to offer total resistance and make sacrifices in defense of the socialist motherland. Among the measures Stalin took to confront the initial catastrophe was the immediate mobilization of millions of citizens, including his own children. In a gesture that was both symbolic and propagandistic, Stalin sent his eldest son, Yakov Dzugashvili, to the front as an artillery officer. His other son, Vasily Dzhugashvili, was also called up and assigned to the Soviet Air Force. Stalin sought to show that, even at the height of his power, he would not place himself above the sacrifices demanded by the war. Yet there are signs that the decision was also emotionally complex, shaped by his conflicting feelings toward his sons. Despite the success of the initial offensive, Operation Barbarossa was far from the swift conclusion Hitler had planned. The vastness of Soviet territory, logistical difficulties, fierce resistance from local populations, and the Soviet capacity to regroup all began to hinder the German advance. Although severely battered, the Red Army did not collapse entirely. As the summer wore on, the Germans began to realize that the war in the East would be far longer, more brutal, and more costly than they had expected. We will return to that later. For now, we turn back to Stalin's son. Yakov Dzugashvili was 34 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. A lieutenant in the Red Army, he served in a heavy artillery unit. He was assigned to the 14th Howitzer Regiment of the 14th Tank Division, one of many formations hastily mobilized to halt the Wehrmacht's devastating advance during the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa. Despite being the son of the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, Yakov held no senior command and, at least officially, received no special treatment that kept him away from the front. His battlefield role was real and dangerous, exposing him to all the brutal uncertainties of a conflict rapidly escalating into total war. Yakov's fate took a tragic turn during the bloody Battle of Smolensk, fought between July and August 1941. Smolensk was a strategically vital point on the road to Moscow, and its defense would cost thousands of lives. Disorganized and poorly equipped, the Soviet forces faced not only German military might, but also the burden of misinformation, bureaucratic rigidity, and the constant fear of internal reprisals for any mistake. Amid the chaos and confusion, Yakov's unit was surrounded by German armored forces after a series of setbacks on the Western Front. His superiors ordered a withdrawal in a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of the Soviet positions in the region. Yet, according to an account widely circulated afterward, Yakov refused to retreat. A statement was attributed to him: "I am Stalin's son, and I do not authorize my unit to withdraw." The authenticity of this statement remains disputed. Some scholars believe it may have been a later fabrication, manipulated both by Nazi propagandists seeking to discredit the Soviet regime and by the Soviets themselves, who were eager to shape a narrative of heroism and martyrdom in a time of crisis. The exact circumstances of Yakov's capture remain a matter of debate among historians. Some argue that he was betrayed by jealous or resentful comrades who were troubled by his name and the political symbolism it carried, even though he held no prestigious position. Other accounts suggest that Yakov recognized the military situation as untenable, and fearing for the lives of his men, chose to surrender to prevent a pointless massacre. Although such a decision would have been understandable on humanitarian grounds, it directly contradicted official Soviet doctrine, which condemns surrender as one of the gravest forms of treason against the motherland. Regardless of the motivations or the details behind his decision, the fact remains that in July of 1941, Yakov was captured by German forces. Stalin's reaction to the news was equally dramatic and shrouded in silence. The Soviet leader had decreed that no soldier could surrender under any circumstances, classifying such acts as unforgivable treason. He received the news as a direct affront. According to accounts from people close to him, Stalin was reportedly furious and deeply ashamed. In a statement that has endured over the years and become a symbol of the dictator's merciless character, he allegedly said, "There are no prisoners of war. There are traitors." Later, he is said to have confided, "Yakov is no longer my son. I would rather see him dead than in the enemy's hands." The truth of these words is also a matter of debate. At the very least, however, they reflect the harsh political and emotional environment surrounding Stalin. The episode not only wounded his pride as supreme leader, it also touched a personal wound he would never publicly acknowledge: the difficulty of confronting fatherhood, authority, and family failure. Throughout his life, Yakov was consumed by a role he had never chosen: the involuntary heir to a father who saw human frailty as an unforgivable defect. Sadly, as we will see, Yakov's time in captivity would be marked by suffering, failed attempts at an exchange, and a tragic end that would symbolically close the troubled relationship between father and son, and, at the same time, between the individual and the totalitarian system to which he was subordinated. Are you enjoying the content so far? Then take the opportunity to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss any of our upcoming videos. And if this material helped or interested you, leave a like. It is essential to our ability to keep producing quality content. If you enjoy narratives based on historical fact, comment, "I want more stories." This not only motivates us to continue the work, but also helps the content reach more people who share the same interest. All set? With those reminders out of the way, let us now understand what happened to Yakov after he was captured by the Germans. How did the Nazis treat Yakov? Shortly after his capture by German forces, Yakov Dzugashvili, aware of the danger posed by the discovery of his identity, tried to conceal his military rank. Records indicate that he may have torn the insignia from his uniform in an attempt to pass himself off as an ordinary Red Army officer. His effort was in vain. Whether through the documents he was carrying, his distinctive accent, or an appearance already known to intelligence services, Yakov was quickly identified as the eldest son of Joseph Stalin. That immediately transformed his capture from an ordinary episode of war into an issue of immense propagandistic and strategic value for the Third Reich. Once in custody, Yakov was taken to interrogations conducted by the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service. The agents were eager to obtain any information that could be exploited both militarily and symbolically. In his initial statements, according to records preserved by the Germans, Yakov reportedly expressed frustration with the disorganization of Soviet forces. He went so far as to say that the Red Army was unprepared for a conflict of that magnitude, sharply criticizing the quality of its equipment, the hesitant performance of its generals, and the complete lack of coordination among the different commands on the front. More surprisingly, according to the same documents, Yakov reportedly expressed some skepticism about the effectiveness of the British as allies, and even offered occasional praise for the discipline and organizational structure of the German army. Whether those statements were actually made, or were fabricated or exaggerated for propaganda purposes, remains an open question. The Nazis had every interest in portraying Stalin's son as a collaborator disillusioned with his own regime. Manipulating words, omitting context, and fabricating entire statements were not uncommon practices in the Reich's propaganda circles. Once the prisoner's identity had been confirmed, the Nazi propaganda machine, directed with precision by Joseph Goebbels, quickly swung into action. Carefully staged photographs showed Yakov apparently healthy, well-fed, and, in some images, even smiling beside German soldiers. Leaflets bearing the photographs were dropped over Soviet lines, accompanied by messages purportedly written by Yakov himself. One read, "Dear Father, I have been captured, but I am well. I will soon be transferred to an officers' camp in Germany. I am being treated with dignity. I wish you good health." The intention was clear: to demoralize Soviet troops and undermine the credibility of the regime's official message. If even Stalin's son had surrendered and was being treated decently by the enemy, why should anyone else fight to the death? Yakov's capture thus became a central element in the psychological war between Berlin and Moscow. The Soviet response was contradictory, to say the least. Publicly, Yakov was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, one of the Red Army's highest decorations, in recognition of his courage in battle. Yet all the evidence suggests that the honor was purely symbolic, an attempt to preserve an image of heroism despite an embarrassing episode. Behind the scenes, the reality was very different. Deeply shaken, Stalin regarded his son's surrender not only as a military failure, but as a personal betrayal. The dictator demanded absolute resistance from his soldiers and considered any surrender a crime. According to people close to him, Stalin said that Yakov should have killed himself rather than surrender. The Germans initially planned to use Yakov in radio broadcasts, having him read prepared statements intended to demoralize the Soviet government and praise the treatment he had received from the Nazis. But Yakov's refusal to cooperate thwarted the plan. As an alternative, the Nazis chose to transfer him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, about 35 kilometers from Berlin. Founded in 1936, the camp was regarded as a model of the Nazi repressive system. Political opponents, persecuted minorities, and, from 1941 onward, prisoners of war, especially Soviet prisoners, were held there. Sachsenhausen was not an extermination camp in the industrial sense of Auschwitz or Treblinka, but its regime was brutal. Prisoners were subjected to forced labor in subhuman conditions, with inadequate food, violent punishment, and the constant threat of death. Although Yakov was spared the most degrading tasks because of his identity, that did not mean he lived in comfort. He was kept in isolation under close surveillance and became an object of observation and speculation for regime officials, who were curious to understand the behavior of Stalin's son. Even in this relatively exceptional situation, Yakov lived through months of extreme tension. The Germans regarded him as a potential bargaining chip, but also as an awkward symbol. He refused to cooperate and remained steadfastly hostile, even becoming involved in conflicts with other prisoners. Later testimonies from British inmates indicate that Yakov was a difficult figure. Reserved and proud by nature, he avoided social gatherings and made no effort to hide his contempt for those who, in his view, treated the Germans with excessive complacency. Imprisonment and isolation further deepened his emotional distress. Throughout his life, Yakov had endured a troubled relationship with his father, marked by distance, coldness, and rejection. Now he bore the weight of rejection not only as a son, but also as a soldier and a national symbol. Although he refused to betray his principles, he found no relief anywhere. His enemies treated him with hostility, his own country ignored him, and he was left to fend for himself in an increasingly claustrophobic prison. Over the following months, Yakov's name would resurface at critical moments in negotiations between the Nazis and the Soviets, as we will see next. The end of Stalin's son. As the tide of the Second World War began to turn, especially after the Red Army's decisive victory at Stalingrad in February 1943, Soviet confidence grew while Nazi morale declined. The surrender of the German Sixth Army, commanded by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, was not only a devastating military blow to Hitler, but also a profound symbolic defeat. It was the first time a German field marshal had surrendered in battle, defying the Führer's explicit order to fight to the death. At the same time, this shift in the war revived an idea that had previously been little more than speculation in diplomatic and military circles. Exchanging Yakov Dzugashvili, still a Nazi prisoner and Joseph Stalin's eldest son, for Paulus, now being held on Soviet soil. The proposal seemed audacious, almost theatrical. On one side was the son of the Soviet Union's supreme leader, captured and held by the Germans as a living trophy. On the other was one of the Third Reich's highest-ranking commanders, whose surrender had publicly humiliated Hitler. The Germans knew that Stalin's prestige might be at stake. They believed an exchange could be a strategic masterstroke, allowing them to recover a valuable military commander while publicly embarrassing the Soviet dictator by forcing him to act out of personal interest. Stalin's response, however, was cold, brutal, and final. "I will not trade a lieutenant for a field marshal," he is said to have declared. The words would go down in history as a cruel example of his inflexibility, emotional coldness, and refusal to show favoritism, even in the face of personal suffering. To Stalin, Yakov was first and foremost a Soviet soldier who had surrendered, an unacceptable act under the regime's strict doctrine of absolute resistance, rather than a son worth rescuing. However rational that decision may have seemed politically or militarily, it had devastating consequences for Yakov. From then on, the Nazis knew that Yakov no longer held any strategic value. Their hopes of using him as a bargaining chip evaporated, and his presence came to be seen as a burden. Isolated, under constant surveillance, and facing mounting pressure, Yakov remained at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he had been interned months earlier. On April 14, 1943, his life came to an abrupt end under circumstances that remain shrouded in uncertainty to this day. Over the years, several different accounts of his death have emerged. The most widely accepted account holds that Yakov took his own life by deliberately throwing himself against the electrified fence surrounding the camp. Such deaths were tragic, but common among prisoners in Nazi camps, especially those in profound despair or desperate to end their prolonged suffering. At Sachsenhausen, guards routinely left electrocuted bodies on display for hours as a silent warning to the other inmates. Plausible though it is, this is not the only explanation. Another theory suggests that the Germans summarily executed Yakov. After the Soviet Union refused to negotiate an exchange for him, he was allegedly seen as a useless burden. Some believe that his behavior, described by witnesses as haughty, aggressive, and at times provocative, angered the guards enough for them to kill him deliberately. A third line of inquiry emerged after the war, based on documents examined by British intelligence. According to this account, Yakov became embroiled in a heated argument with British prisoners who were also being held at Sachsenhausen, probably over ideological differences, resentment, or mutual distrust. The confrontation reportedly reached a breaking point. Visibly distressed, Yakov left the group and ran toward the electrified fence. The question remains, was this a conscious act of suicide or an impulsive attempt to escape during an emotional crisis? The most disturbing element of this account is the claim that, after Yakov fell to the ground, injured by the electric shock, a Nazi guard shot him, supposedly to make certain he was dead. Whatever version comes closest to the truth, Yakov's death left deep scars. Publicly, the Soviet regime suppressed the episode, handling it discreetly and, for many years, avoiding any direct mention of Stalin's son or his fate. Among senior Kremlin officials, however, reports circulated that the Soviet leader had reacted with unexpected emotion when he learned of Yakov's death. Although Stalin never publicly expressed regret, those close to him said he began keeping a photograph of his son on his desk and would gaze at it in silence for long periods. It was a subtle but revealing gesture from a man renowned for his impassivity. Yakov became a tragic figure not only because of the circumstances of his death, but also because of what his life came to symbolize. He was the son of the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, yet he lived as an outsider within his own family. Raised far from his father, he grew up in the shadow of a leader who became ever more distant and impersonal. Rejected by Stalin from an early age, Yakov reportedly even attempted suicide as a teenager because of his father's coldness. He spent his life trying to prove his worth, as a student, as an army officer, and as a prisoner who refused to collaborate with the enemy. His lonely death in a Nazi camp represents not only the collapse of a family relationship, but also the dehumanizing effects of totalitarian regimes that sacrifice everything, even their own children, in the name of ideology. Some historians argue that, under different circumstances, Yakov might have played a significant role in the Soviet power structure. He had a solid academic background and showed an interest in technical and strategic matters. With his father's support, he might have been groomed as a political heir, or at least as a prestigious figure within the system. That path, however, passed instead to his half-brother Vasily Dzugashvili, Stalin's son by his second wife. Although Vasily rose to the rank of general, his career was marred by scandal, alcoholism, and emotional instability. This has led many to wonder how the Soviet Union's fate might have differed if Yakov had been given a genuine chance. Yakov was also the last living link to Stalin's first wife, Kato Svanidze. According to many biographers, her early death in 1907 was the most devastating event of the future dictator's youth. Kato's death plunged Stalin into a private grief that he never openly expressed, but which appears to have contributed to the coldness of his human relationships from that point on. In this sense, Yakov was more than an estranged son. He was the living embodiment of a personal loss Stalin preferred to forget. And perhaps for that very reason, Stalin was never able to truly love him. The death of Yakov Dzugashvili is therefore a tragedy within the greater tragedy of the war, a human drama shaped by abandonment, pride, silence, and death. It reveals not only the tensions of the era, but also the brutality of a regime in which not even the dictator's own blood was spared the relentless logic of war and ideology. So, what did you think of Yakov Dzugashvili's story? Were you already familiar with this unusual episode from the Second World War? If there are any topics you would like us to cover, share your suggestions in the comments. Your input is always welcome. Thank you for watching to the end. Make sure you are subscribed, turn on notifications for future videos, and leave a like. It helps us continue producing high-quality content. And if you would like to explore more remarkable chapters from history, simply click the recommended video now appearing on screen. We'll see you there.